Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. Got the whole crew with us, Kipp Adams and Ben Wolk, on this Tuesday afternoon. And fellas, it's Alabama week. Number 2 Georgia getting ready to go to Tuscaloosa on Saturday and take on the number 4 Crimson Tide. A lot to get into on this episode. A lot of discussion, obviously, about one of the marquee games to this point in the college football season. Before we dive into that, I want to rewind. Go back to this past weekend, fellas. It's rare that we get a chance to watch a whole lot of college football, but thanks to Georgia's first bye week, had the opportunity to do so. So, I want to kind of talk about that, and I'll start with you, Ben. How was the bye week weekend for you, and did any games stand out to you that you were able to watch?
Well, yeah, it was a full slate of college football for me on Saturday. I loved it. I loved every second of it. I wish every week was a bye week. No, I'm just kidding. But the game that stood out to me the most, I expected it to go the way that it did, but I was watching the Tennessee-Oklahoma game. You all have probably seen me on the Junkyard. I believe very strongly in Tennessee this year. I think that they've always had one of the more electric offenses, but I think that they have a possible top 5 defense, if not top 3 defense, if not the best defense in college football this season. And so I was interested to see how they held up. Not that Oklahoma was like the most dynamic offense that they were going to face this season, but I just wanted to see you go on the road. We've seen Georgia go on the road, first SEC game. It doesn't always look pretty, and it looked pretty for a large majority of it, other than, Nico's 2 strip sacks that resulted in short fields for Oklahoma that they immediately gave the ball right back to Tennessee. It was a pretty dominant performance from Tennessee in that one. And I know a lot of folks will point to the Michael Hawkins Jr. touchdown drives later in the game. I think that, again, as Georgia folks, we can look at it and say that we know what life is like when backup quarterbacks come in when you're not expecting them to, and the games change and what their skill sets are change, and what you prepared for isn't what you're seeing. So I think that that was a game that Tennessee was going to win handily no matter how many times they played it.
Yeah, the fact they went into Norman and played like they did, very impressed. You talk about that defense. I think about the safety they had when Oklahoma was on the goal line. I mean, they were on that running back basically from the snap, and I was very impressed. And as it's been talked about quite a bit, big win for Josh Heupel going back to Oklahoma. Certainly cool to see. Kipp, what about you? How was your bye weekend, and did any games stand out to you?
I'll make sure my mic's on there before I start talking here. But just to start off with what you guys were talking about, that Tennessee defense, I'm going through and I'm looking through the stats each week. And number 1 in yards per play allowed doesn't really count. It's Ohio State. I mean, they have not played anyone. Number 5, Ole Miss, also haven't played anyone. You see Alabama and Georgia there at 3 and 4. Not surprising. That's what they've been doing for the last decade. But to see Tennessee number 2 in the country, allowing just 3.13 yards per play, it's truly impressive. And I think that, we've talked about the issues with Tennessee's team, and the fact that the pacing of their offense has put their defense in harm's way throughout the season. And you kind of look at that second half, and people are wondering, did Josh kind of put his foot on the brakes in the offense? I don't know. I just think that he's learning, just like Kirby Smart learned early on his tenure, that you probably can't go completely conservative on offense. You have to kind of, you have to let your offense evolve. And at the same time, I think that's where Josh Heupel is. He's understanding that, you can put your defense in better situations by having that, slowing things down a little bit and giving your defense a chance to breathe. He's got what looks like a smothering defense, and I think that's a championship trait. Travis Hunter doing it all. The amount of snaps he's playing is ridiculous. We haven't seen this since, like Charles Woodson, Champ Bailey. I don't know how good that team's going to be overall towards the season, but I just think that you look at him, I look at him from the NFL draft perspective, and I'm like, this guy is going to create a lot of question marks for draft for scouts. Like, how do you analyze someone like this? Is he going to be a Shohei Ohtani type player in NFL and actually play both ways? I'm not really sure. I think he probably, if he just played wide receiver, it'd allow us to kind of compare him a little bit better. And I just think he's a great question, and he's good for college football because it's just unique to watch him. And I guess the last thing is just, my goodness, that Auburn quarterback situation. I look around the SEC. I think even Florida. I mean, they got good quarterback play this past weekend from Graham Martz and DJ Lagway, and then you look at Auburn, and I mean they don't have any answers at quarterback, and it looks like their head coach is just throwing them all under the bus. And what you saw what Bo Wallace said on X, and kind of throwing Hugh Freeze under the bus a little bit as well. But I mean, this is not a good look for the program right now, and I think kind of the risk in them hiring him is kind of bringing that to the forefront, is where it looks like things are really shaky on the Plains right now.
You guys hit on the majority of the games I would have talked about. One with Baylor, Colorado. I don't know what defense Baylor was calling on that last play, and I think Dave Aranda said afterwards that play was called Victory Cigar. I would have gone to my grave before telling the media that. I don't care if that's the case. Just make up something else. And, yeah, Auburn's in a bad way. 4 interceptions. I mean, I think at this point they have no choice but to roll with Peyton Thorne. And kind of tying that in with Tennessee, Oklahoma, talk about an anxiety bowl this upcoming weekend. Oklahoma going to Auburn. If Auburn doesn't win that game, fellas, I think there's a real chance they miss a bowl game. And even on the other side with Oklahoma, Texas that Texas game not that far down the road for them. They could use a win in that game as well, but we know it's always hard to do that when you go to Jordan-Hare Stadium. Did want to point out, too, talking about Tennessee's really good defense. Can either one of y'all tell me who Tennessee's defensive line coach is right now?
Rodney Garner.
Rodney Garner, Coach G.
It's crazy when you watch Rodney Garner defensive lines. It's like, oh my gosh, we do it all the time. It's like, oh, where did Rodney Garner end up? And then all of a sudden you look 3 years later and it's like, oh my God, that defensive line is one of the best in college football. How does this keep happening?
Yes, Rodney Garner is one of the best, and he's showing it in Knoxville. Well, mentioning the Week 5 slate with Auburn and Oklahoma, let's talk about the marquee game, the one that a couple of us are going to be at on Saturday night. Georgia going to Alabama, one of the top games to this point in the young college football season. A lot of intrigue going into this game. Both teams coming in off of a bye week. Georgia having beaten Kentucky the week before 13-12. Alabama beat Wisconsin 42-10 in Madison before they had the chance to have a bye week. We're going to get into this game. And first, guys, let's go through some of what Kirby Smart and the players had to share on Monday. Obviously, as you would expect, Kirby Smart got a lot of questions about Alabama, about Nick Saban. Really downplayed Saban not being there anymore, said that he didn't think it was really going to be strange with Nick not being there on the field. At least he'll be there for College game day. But talked about it being sort of a natural progression. Obviously Saban walking away from the game. Really complimentary of Jalen Milroe. Talked about how much progress he's seen from him. Talked about Ryan Williams, which we'll listen to a clip of that in a few minutes. And I think they know that they're getting ready for a fight. But first clip I wanted to play was Kirby talking about the changes. Obviously, Kalen DeBoer, now the head coach, coming in over from Washington. A lot of new faces. Here is what Kirby had to say about some of the new looks around the Crimson Tide program.
I mean, they're different defensively, for sure. Obviously the offensive staff and defensive staff changed. But there's remnants, because the quarterback's the same, so you keep some things the same with them. And, most of college football is doing something similar. So there's some similarities into that. But obviously the history there that's at Washington, Kalen's history, and then defensively, history Kane has and what they've done this year as well.
Mentioning Kane Womack there, the defensive coordinator who came over from South Alabama. Guys, I mentioned him talking about Jalen Milroe, some of the positives he had to share on the Alabama quarterback. I'll start with you, Ben. What did you think of Kirby's take on Jalen and just this Alabama team they're getting ready to play?
Well, I think there's a weird thing with Jalen Milroe. Whenever people talk about him, they either choose to talk about what he does really well or some of the areas that you feel like you can beat him. And I think that everyone feels the same way about what he does really well. He's one of the most dynamic football players in college football. He Kirby Smart said it, one of the worst things that you can do is cover everybody perfectly, because that means that he basically turns into a kick returner at quarterback. And you've seen what he can do getting downhill, moving the chains, having explosive runs. He has one of the best deep balls in college football. I mean, his explosive play rate on passes over 20 yards is one of the best in, the last 5 years. He throws a majority of his touchdown passes over 20 yards in the air. So, I mean, he is someone that is looking to throw the ball down the field and beat teams. And that's the way that he does it just changes a game so quickly that, there's times that things just unravel. The game snowballs for opposing defenses because you blink and all of a sudden it's almost like Steph Curry, where it's like you look up and all of a sudden this guy that you thought wasn't playing that great all of a sudden has taken over a game because of just some explosive plays. And so I sort of how I view him. Then you look at, okay, what does he not do as well? I mean, it's not rocket science to look at his intermediate passing numbers and know that Alabama doesn't really try and have him throw the ball in the middle of the field a whole lot, or 10 to 19 yards. They also don't have a ton of success when he does do it. I mean, if you're looking at how are you going to attack him, you want to get him into an intermediate passing game. I don't envision Alabama to get suckered into that. I think that you're going to have to beat Jalen Milroe doing the things that Jalen Milroe does best. And I think that that's what Kirby Smart clearly wanted to highlight when he was talking about Jalen Milroe yesterday. I mean, we know Kirby Smart's not going to go into a press conference and acknowledge anything that Jalen Milroe doesn't do well. But I think that highlighting the things that he does exceptionally well is critical for him in sending that messaging to his defense throughout the week, just because I think sometimes people fall into the trap of saying Jalen Milroe can't pass, Jalen Milroe can't throw. And it's not true. I mean, Jalen Milroe, there are types of passes that he maybe doesn't do at an elite level, but he is such a game changer with his arm that I think you have to, respect it. And Kirby Smart said it. He's different than just about anybody that he's played against in recent memory. And that's because he can hit a 70-yard deep shot on you. And when you've got receivers as dynamic as Ryan Williams, that can change a game real quick. And like I said, I think that he's viewed as a kick returner when he tucks the ball and runs because of how powerful of a runner he is and how fast he's moving. He just moves differently than anybody else. It's different. It's almost, it's similar to Lamar Jackson, I guess you could say, in terms of like when he tucks and runs, he moves in a way on a football field that other people just simply cannot. And when you're not, I think Kirby, or I don't think it was Kirby Smart that was asked about it. One of the players was asked about it yesterday, Smile Munden, I believe, of, how are they preparing for it? And it's a hard question to answer because there's not other human beings out there that are able to do it. And because if they did, they would be starting quarterbacks in the SEC too.
Yeah, to that point, I believe it was Seth Emerson from The Athletic asked him, and I thought this was a good explanation on trying to defend Jalen. Seth said, pick your poison, and that's a big piece of it. And sort of something I wanted to point to, Ben, that you said, comparing it to like Steph Curry, Jalen to me also has the thing where you're like, he's not playing that well. You look at his stats and you're like, go look, at the SEC title game last year. His numbers weren't off the charts good, but he made the plays when Alabama had to have them. And, ultimately he had a big part in Alabama winning that game.
No, I do think that if you're going to beat this Alabama team, you got to pressure him. You got to make him make bad decisions. I think that if your blueprint is let's hope and pray that Jalen Milroe makes some bad mistakes, you're not probably it's not a winning game plan. Like, I think that if that, that's what you're trying to do, is just not going to work. So I think that you got to do what you can to fluster him. But ultimately, I think that it comes down to, you got to make some plays on defense. And really, I think, as is always the case against these Alabama teams, they're going to get their points. Georgia's got to find a way to score enough points to outscore them.
Totally agree. Kipp, what did you make of what Kirby had to say specifically on what's different about Alabama? Obviously, he made this point a little bit later in the presser of they're still playing with a lot of Nick Saban's players, but obviously a new coaching staff with Kalen DeBoer and a new crew running the show behind the scenes.
Yeah, their offensive line's playing better. You look at last season, they were allowing like 3.5 sacks per game, and a lot of that comes with Jalen extending the plays and them having to, protect a pocket that, moves and breaks down whenever he's trying to make a play. But they're only allowing 2 sacks per game this year. And I think with that, makes it harder because now you're trying to get him out of the pocket, but he's able to step up. And I think that's the part of Jalen Milroe's game that doesn't get talked about enough. I mean, to Ben's point, I mean, I wouldn't even call him a kick returner. He's more like Jalen Hurts out there. He's really strong. He's a weight room warrior, and he's basically a 6'2", 225-pound running back out there when he tucks it. But when he's just stepping up in the pocket, he's got a very accurate deep ball. And I think that the arm strength allows him to really hit Ryan Williams on some big plays. And he's confident enough to let it rip. I think that's the kind of the biggest difference. You look at what they've done this season. He's getting rid of the ball before Ryan Williams has separation because he knows it's going to happen. And we're talking about just the differences in the two quarterbacks playing in this game, Jalen Milroe is playing extremely confident in the deep passing game right now. And that's just an aspect that for a defensive coordinator, you're like, okay, well, I have to try to get him out of the pocket. But now I have to try to bring him down. If I force him to beat us with his arm, he's just going to, step up in the pocket and make a big play down the field. You could have a great game plan, but then Jalen just takes the game plan and throws it out the window. And I think that's this part of his game where he is that ultimate X factor where you might think you've got the answers, but he just creates new questions for you in the middle of the play. And so I think you have to be willing to pivot and make changes during the game and to come at him differently based on his tendencies during the game, knowing that from any given play, he just might change up what he's doing and beat you a different way.
Ben mentioned earlier Ryan Williams. And guys, I don't know if y'all know this. Y'all know he's only 17 years old?
That's the first time I've ever heard that. You're telling me for the first time.
So on a serious note, Kirby was asked about him and asked if he felt like he was, part of this line of great Alabama receivers that we've seen over the years. And I thought Kirby gave a really good answer on what Ryan Williams brings to the table. Let's hear what Kirby had to say.
Yeah, he's in the same line with the guys they've had in the past. Super quick, talented, confident with the ball, great ball skills, great quickness. He's a track athlete that was elite. He's a junior, then he comes out and he's already performing at a high level. I don't think that there's a lot of anxiety or nerves for him. He's not one of these guys that the moment's too big for him. He naturally jumped right in and has made plays in every game. And they have a lot of really good skill players out on the perimeter, and I think that Jalen does a good job of using his skill set to get them the ball.
Obviously, he's only 17 has been talked to death, but on a serious note, I have been really impressed with Ryan Williams because before the season started, back when we were at Media Days, I did a story about the big questions for all of the teams on Georgia's schedule. And my big question for Alabama was who were going to be those skill players who stepped up around Jalen, specifically receiver. And Ryan Williams seemed like an obvious guy to point to. But again, I mean, he should be a senior in high school right now. How exactly is he going to adjust? Now, they haven't played a killer schedule. They played Western Kentucky. They played South Florida, who I do think is better, but they're still not a marquee team. And you're playing a Wisconsin team, albeit on the road, obviously makes it more challenging. I don't think that Wisconsin team's very good. I think they'll be lucky if they go to a bowl game. So still not totally tested, but I like what I've seen so far from Ryan Williams, and he's going to be someone Georgia has to account for. Ben, what do you think of what we've seen to date from Ryan Williams and the challenge he's going to present to what we think is a really good Georgia secondary?
Well, Ryan Williams is who he was expected to be. I mean, it's funny. Recruiting isn't super complicated sometimes when everybody in the world wants Ryan Williams, and then all of a sudden he comes in and he's immediately a game changer. It's not super surprising. I mean, I think he's the first Mr. Alabama football the first two-time Mr. Alabama football, and he still had time to reclassify, which means he probably would have been three-time Mr. Alabama football. I mean, it's like Kirby Smart said, when you're an elite track athlete and also have elite ball skills, elite football player. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're 17. It doesn't matter how much time you have. I mean, I think typically the bigger issues with skill guys like that at that age, to Kirby Smart's point, are anxiety, nerves. Ryan Williams' personality is going to just remove any and all of that. I mean, he is built for these types of moments. So it really doesn't surprise me to see him playing at this level. I think that the bigger thing is probably credit to him for the amount of trust that he's built up with Jalen Milroe, with his offensive coaches, that it didn't take them any time whatsoever. Like, there was no transition filter period, getting him used to, acclimated to everything. It was just immediately Ryan Williams is plug and play in this Alabama offense. And I think that's the part that shows just how special he is.
Kipp, what about you? What has struck you about Ryan Williams to this point and the challenge he's going to present to the Bulldogs on Saturday night?
It's how do they keep finding these guys? It's ridiculous. I mean, Ben and I saw him at the Under Armour camp, and I mean, he was the best player there, and he hadn't reclassified then. We were just saying this guy is head and shoulders above everyone else that's in this venue. And you look back, I mean, people are going to bring up Devonta Smith. They're going to bring up Jamison Williams. I mean, I'll say Calvin Ridley. It's just, their games are similar. And you cannot give him a free release off the line of scrimmage. I mean, that's it. They are going to make you pay on the slot fade all day with him. And so I think he is going to put a lot of pressure on the secondary to lock in through the whistle, regardless of what Georgia's plan is. I mean, they can rush 4, they can spy 2 on Jalen. The DBs are going to have to lock through again, like I said, through the whistle against guys like Ryan Williams, because he'll make you pay. And I think that I'm fascinated to see what Georgia's defensive game plan is. I think these are games where, everyone's going to talk about Dalen Everett, and obviously Julian Humphreys is going to be important too, because they're going to move them all around. But this is a make or break game. This is that NFL draft film that you can put up and say that, you perform this way against him, but he's going to get his no matter what. I just think that I don't see a situation where he's just completely covered the entire game, even though Kirby has done pretty well shutting down number 1 receivers in the past. His skill set just makes me think that he's going to get free for a big play or two. You just have to limit those yards after the catch. I think the safety play is going to be really important. I think this is a game where you're going to be asking a lot of Malachi Starks. He's going to have to cover a lot of ground, but I think that's why you have a guy like that on your roster. I think he could be the difference in, a 16-yard first down play or a 48-yard touchdown pass. And so I think that's the situation where this is going to be. And again, credit to Alabama. They somehow just have 5-star wideouts in their backyard. It's sometimes it pays to get lucky sometimes. And I'm just I know the Crimson Tide have been looking to catch a break in recruiting, and tip your hat to them for getting a guy like Ryan Williams on the roster.
I saw Kobe in the comments mention Dalen Everett, and I popped on the Bama 24/7 podcast. I'm not sure when that episode will go up, but Dalen Everett is the guy that I think is the key player for Georgia, specifically on defense, because they're going to challenge that entire secondary. How does Dalen play, and does he show up ready? Because like you said, I'm very much with Kipp. You can't stop Ryan Williams. You can only hope to contain him. But like you said, if they cut what could have been a 50-yard play into a 15-yard catch, you got to take that, and you take your wins where you can get them, because this Alabama offense is definitely explosive. We're going to take a quick break, come back. Still got a few more clips from Kirby Smart and the players, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this matchup. Guys, circling back to some of Kirby Smart's comments, thought this was really interesting. At one point, Kirby was asked about Georgia's slow starts on offense so far this season. Obviously, I think that's a huge point in this game. Like we just talked about, how explosive Alabama's offense can be. Here's what Kirby said about some of Georgia's slow starts and how they're trying to combat it.
Well, I wouldn't say that we've started fast. I would say that everybody wants to start fast, but sometimes it's like that. And sometimes there's no rhyme and reason, and then sometimes there's things you do that you could do better, you could execute better. Sometimes they just beat you and they just whip you. And it's gone both ways, offensively and defensively. We've had drives defensively that we gave up too much field position and too many consecutive third downs that we didn't get off the field that maybe just made our offense start backed up. But it hasn't been perfect. But we have shown resiliency, and that's a trait that I would probably trade outside of perfect. I would trade a lot of traits for resiliency.
I will say I really liked Kirby's comment there about resiliency, saying, basically aside from perfect, I would trade a lot for resiliency. But I'll kind of lead this one off, guys, and then set you guys up. I mean, the slow starts are a big reason why I have concern for Georgia going into this game. This offense just sort of looked out of sorts against Kentucky. Spoiler alert, but this Alabama team is more talented than that Kentucky team they played in Lexington. I need to see something from this team, particularly in this first half, because you do not want to be digging yourself out of a hole at Bryant-Denny Stadium trying to come back against a really, really talented Alabama team. And I'll throw it to you first, Kipp. How much concern do you have about this offense, specifically because of these slow starts we've seen to this point in the year?
Based on what we've seen so far this season, I do not have a lot of confidence in this offense, if that's what we're basing it off. Georgia has had issues with its offensive line calls. You're down arguably your most talented offensive lineman in Tate Ratledge. We've seen, I don't want to use the word regression, but we've seen a Carson Beck who has not been confident. And yeah, they have not attacked opposing defenses early in the game. So the game plan is going to have to change. And everyone just throws it on Mike Bobo's hands, but this is an entire offensive coaching staff situation where, Stacey Searles has to get the line calls. Maybe you need to simplify things, and just run gap scheme, find some success. Because I think Alabama's just going to look at what Kentucky did and say, yeah, let's just do that. Let's just run these stunts and confuse them. They're not pushing the ball. And so I think that's where you have to change things up a little bit. And Carson Beck's going to have to, I've said it before, he's going to have to let it rip and let it rip early and be confident. So I think based on where we are right now, we can go into the game plan a little bit more, but Georgia's going to have to come out and just play fearlessly on offense. They cannot come out there and play conservative and think that they're just going to, have success early in this game in an environment that, they haven't played a lot of these types of games recently in, opposing environments where the other team expects to win.
For sure. Ben, what do you make of these slow starts, and how much concern does it give you going into this big game in Tuscaloosa?
It's, plain and simple, it's a game I don't think you can start slow. And I don't think that's just an offensive thing. Like, I think defensively you can't start slow either, because I just don't think you can get behind and be trailing against Alabama at Alabama with what they have on defense. I try to not get too analytics nerdy on here, but I will say they're number one in the country in EPA per drop back, defensively, which basically means Georgia does not want to find itself in a situation where it is predictably passing the football and trying to come from behind, because it's just not going to be a recipe for success against this Alabama football team. I think that it's not a news flash that you don't want to be behind early against a good football team, especially on the road. So yeah, I don't have concerns about the slow start. Like, I do think we're probably making a little bit too much about specifically what we've seen this year and not what the team is capable of doing. I realize that everyone's going to use the sample size that they have to go off of, but I mean, we have seen Carson Beck and Dylan Bell and Dom Lovett be dynamic together. We just haven't seen it really come together this season. And so I think that the possibility is clearly there for Georgia to be dynamic early on offense, start fast, not be playing from behind. I think that if Georgia doesn't do that, it's going to be a long night.
For sure, and it's going to be something that we are going to watch very, very closely once this thing gets underway on Saturday night. Well, a few clips here from Kirby and as well as the two players we talked to, receiver Arian Smith, linebacker Smile Munden. I thought this was really interesting. Obviously, it's no secret. Alabama won the last meeting between these two teams back in December, the SEC title game. At one point, Kirby was asked, what does the staff do to make sure that the players aren't chasing ghosts, trying to make up for a game that has already been played? Here's what Kirby had to say.
Nope. I mean, I don't think we chase the past at all. I don't think that you watch the tape, the two different teams, we're focused on like what we can do to be our best this week. The ghost we're chasing is past performances this year and what we can do to clean that up and how we can be more efficient. I wouldn't say it's anything to do with them.
It is sort of a fine line that these guys have to walk, and I'll play before we really jump into discussion. Arian Smith talking about it because they're trying really to use that loss in December as motivation, but not getting caught up in it. And Arian, I thought, did a good job sort of explaining the attitude coming into this game. He was asked about, this Alabama game kind of lingering on this schedule, week 5. You got games before it. Arian talked about sort of balancing that and Georgia's approach to this game.
Yes, we definitely have like a chip on our shoulder because we're obviously another good team just like they are. So people can say what they say about the game and predictions. And so just trying to let that bother us and play the game like we do any other game. And coach tells us we don't got to do anything else different to win the game that we do at practice. So just take what I do at practice and take it to Saturday.
I thought that was a really good point that Arian made of, the message we hear year after year and game after game for Georgia is they make the practices so hard so that we can go out there and we can find success. That's still the approach they're trying to take with this game. Obviously, again, the history between these two teams. Ben, what do you think about the balancing act that this team has? You want to keep the focus on who you're playing on Saturday. Again, new team, new coaching staff. But that there's a piece of these players that know how this thing played out the last time these two teams faced off.
You made the distinction that I think is important between the two things. Like, I think that, on one hand, you want to treat this game like all the other games. You want to go into game planning, everything. You don't want to get too caught up in the fact that it is Alabama. Like, you want to make sure that everything that you're doing day to day throughout this whole week is status quo. At the same time, they can't sit there and deny, and they are very well aware of this, which is why they acknowledge it. Like, guys have mentioned all offseason, they came back because they want to win an SEC championship game. They want to come back because of the way things went against Alabama last year. Smile Munden said it yesterday. Like, he definitely left Atlanta last year feeling some type of way about that game. And they know what Alabama is. They know what people say about Georgia and Alabama. They know that when you look at Georgia's last 45 football games, Alabama is the only one that has caused any kind of blemish on that resume. And so there's no denial, I don't think, from anybody at Georgia that they recognize Alabama. I just think that when they approach the game, they're not approaching it as Alabama. I think that the reason they believe the reason why those things have happened over the last few years is because Alabama is an elite football team, and Alabama is the reason why they can do that is not because it's Alabama or that there's, that they need to think of them differently. They're doing it because Alabama tends to put together one of the two best football teams in America. And so if Georgia's going to have troubles with anyone, it's going to be the other team that's been, putting together the best football team in America the last 3 years. And so I think that's where everything comes from with them. They don't want to give any bulletin board material. It's why guys are so careful with what they say and how they talk about it, because I'm sure they'd love to come out and be honest and say, of course, like Carson Beck has said in the past, he wanted to come back for reasons that had to do with the way things went in Atlanta last year. You think that he doesn't think about Alabama? Of course he does. They're just not going to let it consume them and affect the game this week, you would think. Now, human nature is human nature. When you get into Tuscaloosa and people are yelling things at you and you realize that you're matched up against a team that you've seen that logo beat you a couple times, who knows how emotions take into, how they take over in that moment.
Yes, important to remember too. We're talking about Alabama won the last game, but it was a 27-24 game. There was just a few plays here and there that made the difference. It's not like Georgia was outclassed, but it's definitely going to be a task for these guys to meet the moment, to not get caught up in the past, and as Kirby said, not find themselves chasing ghosts. Kipp, what do you make of this balancing act of trying to keep the focus on what they got to do on Saturday and not letting that SEC title game beat Georgia twice?
We're acting like Georgia got blown out the last time they played.
Yeah.
And there was a couple plays and, a messed up handoff to Dylan Bell and, where a call on the field where it looked like an incomplete pass or a fumble that didn't get reviewed, and you might have a different outcome in that game. So it's a reminder that when you're playing an elite team, it's a handful of plays that will, determine the outcome. And I think right now, as far as Kirby Smart's concerned, you really do have to filter out the noise. Everyone's saying that this team lacks explosiveness. The easy national narrative is just to look and say, well, they don't have Brock Bowers, they don't have Lad McConkey. I think the bye week really gave them opportunity to go, we have not had the explosives that we want, but it's not because of personnel. And, I think we talked about this before we started the pod. I mean, Dylan Bell, Florida State game, Tennessee game, it looked like it was, those were like his coming out parties. And now this offseason, you see him move positions. He goes from the X receiver, from the Z receiver to the X receiver. Maybe the bye week, you see if Colby Young can play that X receiver, and Dylan Bell goes back to the X so that you can get the ball in his hands more. And then, something that they lacked last season that they have right now and they have the opportunity to use is playmakers in the backfield. I mean, you have Trevor Etienne and you have a Nate Frazier in that first game. The explosiveness he brought to the offense against Clemson, bring that back. And if that means having them both in the backfield at the same time, then go for it. I think you have a couple of very talented, explosive running backs that can be your best friend when you're going to on a road game against, what's going to be the loudest crowd that, Carson Beck's probably ever heard. So you let those guys break off a couple first downs, you shut up the crowd, and now you're able to, really utilize your old playbook and be more comfortable in the pocket. So I just think that Georgia has the personnel to be able to quiet everyone who is saying that this offense doesn't have what it takes. I think that this last bye week, I mean, that was their opportunity to make, those changes based on film. I don't think it's a personnel issue. So I do think that Georgia has the chance to put all that behind them, and you go out there and play a complete game and look really strong against just a different Alabama team. And it's a different head coach, a different scheme. And Kirby's right. None of that stuff matters now.
Yeah, I wanted to make a point too. Kipp was talking about some of the plays here and there, the fumble. You talked about the reviewed play, or the play that wasn't reviewed that Alabama got. Think about the holding, I think, on Micah Morris on the field goal attempt, pushes the field goal back, and Peyton Woodring misses, and you're talking about a game that Georgia loses by 3. So Georgia's been right in there. And to kind of piggyback off of that, I got a really good clip of Smile Munden talking. He was asked about playing Alabama and if, it kind of felt like climbing Mount Everest. And Smile didn't really think that was true. Let's take a listen.
I mean, you said get over the mountain. I wouldn't say it's like getting over a mountain because, we done did that before. But it's fun, really. Like, it's the kind of games like you dream about playing as a kid, a big game like this. They're a real talented team. We're real talented, so it's going to be, exciting. So it's more so like an excitement feeling for me personally, more so than, trying to, scale a mountain.
And I think this kind of goes back to the point we were just making. You can't make this bigger than it is, because if you do that, then you're gonna, be stressed and you're gonna be worried and you're gonna overwhelm yourself. And I always like listening to Smile because he usually shoots you straight. And Ben, I thought he laid it out there pretty clearly. Hey, this is just another game. We know Alabama's talented, but it's not quite like trying to scale them out.
Yeah, I did think he was like flirting with bulletin board material there for a second, where he was like, well, I mean, we did. Like, I think he was almost like, well, I mean, we beat Alabama before. It's not like we got to do something new. But I think he just then tried to avoid that. You can tell how well media trained some of these guys are. They get close to saying something that could be viewed the wrong way. They end up, circling back. But yeah, I mean, it goes back to what we've talked about already. It's clear Georgia's aware that Bama is Bama and that Bama has been the one thorn in Georgia's side, but it's also, I think it's more of a sign of respect that they look at the football team across the field and say, this is the type of football team that's good enough to beat Georgia, not because it's Bama. We're not scared about it because it is Bama. It's just the fact that Bama is Bama, and because of that, you're going to have to play good to beat them.
Yeah, it's a lot of mutual respect, and I would imagine that it's the same on the Alabama side. Kipp, what do you think of what Smile had to say there?
I know from, since the bye week, since the Kentucky game, everyone's been kind of gloom and doom. Like, they're just like, oh, now we have to play Alabama. That's not how these players are taking this. This is why you sign up. This is why you go play for a team like Georgia, for a top 5 matchup on the road, and get a chance to go in to Bryant-Denny Stadium and play in a game that everyone's talking about all week. That's going to have, like, this is basically what a playoff game would look like if it was, still 4 teams. Yeah, the players are excited. The fans can, sweat it out, hydrate all week thinking about it, cope with it however you want. But these players, I mean, this is exactly what they're wanting to do. They want to play in this game. I mean, I think if you're looking back at the last 5 years, 6 years of Kirby Smart's, incredible run at Georgia, it's the games in between these where you kind of see some lulls, you see disappointing performances. The big games, Georgia hasn't really laid an egg in these big games, and that's for a reason. It's much easier for Kirby to get these 5 stars and really talented future NFL draft picks to focus when it's an opponent like this. And so I find it hard to believe that Georgia's going to come out flat against this opponent because it's hard to not tell your players to look ahead to this game when they're all off season. I mean, you look at the schedule and we're talking about, wow, Georgia's playing, at Alabama, at Texas, at Ole Miss. Those are the games we talked about all year. So heaven forbid that maybe the players kind of looked ahead and said, I can't wait to play those games too. And maybe it impacted their play so far this season.
So, guys, before we turn our attention elsewhere, I did want to talk a little bit about this matchup, and I want to go ahead and plug this. 1:00 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday, I'll have Mike Rodak from Bama 24/7 on. We're going to really dive in to the details about this Alabama team and this matchup. But I'm curious from both of you guys, a position matchup that you guys are going to be paying close attention to on Saturday night. And I'll start with mine and say Georgia's wide receivers against Alabama's secondary. We talked about it a little bit earlier. Been a little underwhelmed by what Georgia's receivers have done. It felt like the passing game as a whole was off in that Kentucky game, especially in the first half. But need to see more of Dominic Lovett. Definitely need to see more of Dylan Bell. Maybe Colby Young will be able to really come back. It seems like that hamstring injury from fall camp has lingered a little bit. He has not played quite as much as I expected. So need to make the most of opportunities you get, especially down the field, against a Bama secondary that does have some inexperience, that does have some guys playing in their first really big game while in Tuscaloosa. So see if they can take advantage. And then on the same front with the receivers, I need to see better perimeter blocking. I mean, some of the block attempts, both with the receivers and the tight ends, were I would not have wanted to have been in the meeting room watching film on Sunday after the Kentucky game, because I thought that it really lacked. And we knew that this offense would miss having Ladd McConkey and Brock Bowers, even Marcus Rosemy, Jack Saint, because of what they did downfield. But those guys were blockers you could count on And I don't see a guy right now that I think you just are like, yeah, we know he's going to make that block out there. I need the receivers to step up, and I think it's going to take them having a good game in the run game as well as in the passing game for Georgia to have a chance. Kipp, I'll set you up. What's a matchup you want to see on Saturday? One you're going to be watching very closely.
Georgia's defensive front. Are they able to bring Jalen Milroe down? Are they able to keep him in the pocket and get to him before he can get rid of the ball? Whether that's, you just use stunts, you bring one man. I mean, the last time they played, they did sack him 4 times. And again, that reminded me, I think we were having the same conversation going into that game where I was like, are we going to see them use Jalen Walker more? And boom, they did. And he got to him. And it was like, okay, there it is. That's the player that you give him, 30, 40 snaps, and he's going to have double-digit tackles for loss. And I think he's on pace for that now. And it's incredible how, great players can make plays when given the opportunity. And I think that's a situation I'm watching. I think that they probably – I don't see them bring the house, but I do see them blitzing more than what Kirby Smart would probably prefer him to, because he always mentions how high is the cost when you do that. And I think that is where Jalen Walker comes into play. And I mean, we're going to be watching Mykel Williams. I think that he's going to make the trip regardless, in my opinion, unless he's just straight doubtful in the last report. I think he makes that trip. They try to bring as many defensive linemen as they can in this game. Getting Warren Brinson back would be, going to be huge. I think they do. Jordan Hall is probably the biggest question mark. But again, I just think all these guys travel because up until game time, you're going to give these guys an opportunity to help your football team, because they're going to have to rotate these guys in a lot. And so I'm watching Mykel Williams. I think that, in my opinion, they probably just use him as a situational pass rusher. Let him do what he does best, and not ask him to play 3-4 snaps in a row, because I think it's going to be a pain tolerant situation for him. You're going to get him at his best if you're just using him on those, those obvious passing downs. And I think that's the situation I'm going to watch, because Kalen DeBoer and that offensive staff, they have their offensive line playing better than they did last season. Can Georgia get home to Jalen Milroe and actually bring him down before the ball comes out?
Yeah, it seemed like Alabama sort of got on the right page with its offensive line, probably fourth quarter of that South Florida game, and then played really well against Wisconsin. And yeah, I mean, we know Jalen Walker is the best pass rusher on this team. Just let him loose and let him get after Jalen Milroe. Ben, what about you? What's the matchup you're going to be watching closely on Saturday night?
Well, I was going to describe it as Georgia's offensive line against Alabama's defensive front, but then you brought up the perimeter blocking, and that's been lacking, and I think resulted in some big play possibilities not going the way that Georgia wanted against Kentucky especially, but also against Clemson. But I just think Georgia running the football against Alabama, to me, is going to dictate this game. And I'll throw out another nerd stat. Georgia's 103rd in the country in offensive success rate on rush plays this season, and that is not Georgia-like. You can chalk that up to a few things, probably. Kentucky had a pretty good defensive front, especially on the interior defensive line. That was certainly going to play a factor. Georgia was without its best running back week 1. So there are definitely some factors you can point to that have led to that. But if you're going to correct that, you got to do it this week, because if Georgia does not have, everybody always wants to point to Mike Bobo's play calling, or they want to point to Carson Beck not hitting shots or not having his best game. And some of those things can also be true. But if Georgia's not running the football, Arian Smith said this yesterday, Georgia's not running the football well, the passing game is not going to be finding the success that it needs to have. And so I think Georgia's got to do that on Saturday if Georgia's going to win this game. I think that Georgia has the offensive linemen and has the backs to be able to create some explosive plays out of the running game, but you've got to actually go man up and do it on the road. And I think that ultimately, to me, will decide whether Georgia's offense is productive enough to score enough points to beat Alabama.
Ben, speaking of the run game, there is a big Georgia prospect getting ready to make a decision on where he's headed. What can you tell us about what we need to keep an eye out for on Saturday in addition to this big game?
I can't go on without mentioning how great that segue was from segment to segment there, Jordan. That was unbelievable. It was Monty Croma, 4-star running back from Lee County High School, someone that Georgia fans have been very well aware of throughout his entire high school career, really. I mean, even when I first started covering Georgia recruiting for Dogs 24/7, he was a name that our board would get real excited about anytime that he was mentioned, that we wrote about him. And I think that it's gone back and forth over the years in terms of both sides, how much Georgia was pushing for him and also how much he had real interest in Georgia. And I think that those things really played hand in hand throughout the process. And I think that the turning point for Georgia was when Josh Crawford took over as running backs coach. He had the relationships down at Lee County from being on that state championship coaching staff back in 2017. He had coached Usmani Chroma's older brother who was on that Lee County team. It just made the building of that relationship much easier for both sides. And that's when Georgia really came clearly into the picture with Auburn and Florida State. Tennessee is in the mix as well, but really it's been those other three that have, taken center stage throughout the process. At certain times, it's been Florida State. At certain times, it seemed like it was going to be Auburn. I think that Georgia has done a really good job through a couple of visits. End of summer, I think that they brought Usmani Chroma in on a visit towards the end of the summer and made a very clear pitch to him in terms of why Georgia made sense and why the relationship with Josh Crawford made sense for him and just everything having to do with Georgia as a football program. And they made that pitch. And I think that Georgia felt pretty strongly about that pitch that they had made on that visit. Still, he took some visits to Auburn. He took some visits to Florida State. I think that there was some iffiness on the Georgia side about how strongly they felt after that pitch that they had made over the summer. But the fact that he continued to take it deeper and deeper into the year, I always said, I thought that the longer he took it, the better it was going to be for Georgia, because not knowing that Florida State was going to implode early to start the year the way that it did. But I thought that Florida State was in position to take a step back. Auburn, again, has had a couple of slip-ups that maybe I wouldn't have expected them to have, but you could have seen some areas where Auburn was going to have an uphill battle. And so Georgia has said, I've had people tell me in the past, Georgia feels like one of their best selling points is once the football season begins. And I think the fact that Usmani Chroma waited definitely helped Georgia. He was back on a visit for a game earlier this year. He's now seen Auburn lose. He's seen Florida State lose. He's not seen Georgia lose, and he will be making that decision on Saturday. I don't know exactly what time he's going to be making that decision. It's obviously a weird day to make your decision because it's going to be Georgia's biggest regular season football game in a really long time. It's going to be happening that day. But hey, if Georgia ends up winning that night and Georgia ends up getting Usmani Chroma earlier in the day, I mean, I'm sure that Usmani will have a really fun night celebrating the Georgia win. And I'm sure that Georgia will have a lot of time celebrating that as well. But both of those things still have to play out because I know Auburn and Florida State are not going to go away quietly in this battle for him. And obviously Georgia has a big game to win on Saturday for it to be a perfect day for him.
Be sure to stay glued to dogs247.com. Ben will have you hooked up with all the latest info on Kermani and any of the other recruiting news that is coming in the next few days. UGA Men's Basketball Minute. We had a chance to talk to RJ Godfrey as well as Deshane Montgomery on Monday. Really enjoy listening to RJ Godfrey. If you guys are not familiar, Clemson transfer, Randall Godfrey's son, a very good Georgia football player back in the day. RJ talked about growing up a Georgia fan. He said that he felt like he was back in Athens several times as a kid with his dad being honored for what he did on the football field, but made it sound like a very natural move to go from Clemson to Georgia. Really spoke highly of his relationship with Mike White, and he said that Mike credited him the other day with, bringing the same energy every single day. And to me, I mean, RJ Godfrey's a guy I'm super excited about on this team. Deshane Montgomery, like what he had to share. What I thought was really interesting in talking to him, he was the first guy who committed to Georgia as far as the transfers this offseason. They wound up getting 5. He was the first one. Kind of asked him what went into the thinking and said, he took a visit to Georgia. He felt like, all the opportunities and all of the advantages of coming to Georgia just outweighed anything else. Committed there, and then I think probably a few weeks later, he helps convince his former Mount St. Mary's teammate Dakota LaFew to follow suit. And both those guys know something about playing in Stegman. They played Georgia last year during the non-conference slate, and he talked about the energy in Stegman that night, and he said, that was a non-conference game, so I could only imagine what it'll be like once we get those SEC games underway. So like what those guys had to share, again, November 4th is the season opener. They host Tennessee Tech. And I'm cautiously optimistic about this group. Heard good things so far. We've talked about it to death about how tough it's going to be to win in the SEC. But I do think that they've put together a talented roster, and I'm excited to see them in action. All right, we are going to wrap up the episode right there. Again, I want to plug 1 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday. We will have Bama 24/7's Mike Rodak on to preview this matchup, to learn more about this Alabama team. Obviously, Kalen DeBoer going in to his first SEC game as Crimson Tide head coach. The schedule makers really did him a favor there. Appreciate Kipp and Ben for being on. Thanks to everyone who watched this live or who is watching or listening to this after the fact. As always, go subscribe to Dogs 24/7. We have all the content about this team, about the latest recruiting news. We are set for a big Saturday night in Tuscaloosa, and we hope you guys join us for it. Also, go subscribe to our YouTube. We've got all the Kirby Smart player interviews, got all of the content there. And now that we are getting into basketball season here shortly, Mike White press conferences, player interviews there as well. And go check out TikTok. Got a lot of good content there as well. So for Kipp Adams and Ben Wolk, I'm Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care, everybody.